Welcome to Explore Crime. Today we're going to look at some crimes solved by genealogy. Genealogy is the study of families, which includes family history and the tracing of family lines. Genealogists use historical records, genetic analysis, and other records to obtain information about families, such as forming family trees. Previously, the only way to do this was by using historical records or stories passed down from generations. However, now you can easily do this by taking a DNA test through companies such as Ancestry.com. All you need to do is take a swab from inside your mouth and send it back to them. They will analyze your DNA to tell you what your ethnicity estimate is and form a family tree for you so you can get suggestions on ancestors based on the connections in your DNA. According to estimates from 2019, 26 million people across the globe have used DNA test kits. You may have heard of cases like the Golden State Killer, who murdered 13 people from 1974 to 1986, being solved through genealogy sites. However, today we're going to talk about 4 lesser-known cases. One case where an innocent man was in prison for 17 years until Genetic Genealogy freed him. Now let's get started. Eve Wilkowitz. Eve Wilkowitz was 20 years old when she was murdered in 1980. For 4 decades, her case has gone unsolved, until now. Eve was last seen alive on March 22, 1980. She had been employed as a secretary for a publishing company in Manhattan, and after having dinner and going to a movie with her boyfriend, Jack Dempsey, she was reported to have boarded the 12:39 a.m. Long Island Railroad train at Penn Station to return to her Bay Shore residence. But Eve never made it home. Her roommate, Robert Grogan, reported her missing on the morning of March 24th after discovering she still hadn't returned home. Police then discovered her body 3 days later on the lawn of a residence on Center Avenue, 1 block away from her home. When she was discovered, police said she was missing her coat, blouse, shoes, and pocketbook. There were ligature marks on her wrists, and there were signs that she had been raped. Her cause of death was later determined to be manual strangulation. Eve is believed to have been held captive for several days and then strangled with a rope just hours before her body. Samples of fluids that did not belong to Eve were obtained from her body and stored in evidence for years. In May of 2000, police resubmitted swabs obtained from Eve for further DNA testing based on new technology. They didn't find a match, however the laboratory was able to develop a DNA profile from the swabs. This determined that the DNA came from an unknown male. 21 years went by until an FBI agent specializing in genetic genealogy told detectives she'd found a distant relative of the unknown suspect, along with a last name, Rice. They also identified Herbert Rice was living in the neighborhood at the time of Eve's murder. In August of 2021, the FBI detective approached one of the sons of Herbert and explained that they were looking for a DNA sample to help solve Eve's murder. The son said he hadn't been close to his father and allowed the detective to swab his cheek. The DNA sample verified in late August that his father was Eve's killer. Police wanted to make sure they had the right man. They got a search warrant to exhume Herbert's body. The results came back on March 23, 2022, nearly 42 years to the day Eve went missing. He was the killer. Herbert, however, was already dead. He died of natural causes and was buried on October 18, 1991. Prior to his death, Herbert lived on Central Avenue in Bay Shore, 4 houses away from where Eve's body was first discovered, and within walking distance of the rail station from which Eve was walking at the time of her disappearance. Jody Loomis. Jody Loomis was murdered on 23rd of August 1972 in Washington. She was 20 years old at the time. It would be 47 years until her murder would be solved in 2019, thanks to genealogy. On that day, Jody was planning on going out to ride her horse. Usually Jody's parents drove her to the horse stable and dropped her off. That fateful day was the first time she had decided to take her 10-speed bicycle and ride to the stable 6 miles away from her home on her own. Her body was found in farmland by a couple who had planned to go target shooting, but a fallen tree blocked their path. As they ventured up the dirt road, they got out to move the tree, then they discovered Jody lying there, dying from a gunshot wound to the head. Jody was still alive, but unable to speak to the couple, who raced her to Stevens Hospital, where she was pronounced dead on arrival. Detectives took as much evidence as they could from the crime scene. It wasn't until 2008, when the case was reopened, that they found a stain on her boots, which was tested and came back positive for semen. They could then develop a DNA profile. However, it didn't come back with a hit. In 2018, they submitted it for Genetic Genealogy identification, which linked it to the family member of the suspect, which they identified as Terrence Miller, who was 31 at the time of the murder. In order to make sure that he was the perpetrator, detectives were following his every move until he discarded a coffee cup at the casino, which they tested, and it was an exact match. Terrence was living in Edmonds, Washington, only 17 minutes away from where Jody was murdered at the time of the murder. He had also been accused of sex crimes at least 5 times since the 1960s. Terrence was arrested and sent to trial. However, at 10 a.m. on the day of the verdict, he committed suicide at his home. 3 hours later, at 1 p.m., the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. Angie Dodge. Angie Dodge was only 29 years old when she was murdered in Idaho in June of 1996. It would take one false conviction, one suspect almost arrested and then cleared until they could find the real murderer through genealogy and arrest him in 2019, 23 years later. In the summer of 1996, Angie had just graduated from high school and moved into her own apartment in Idaho Falls, a heavily Mormon town in the state's southeastern corner. She was just discovering who she truly was and wanting independence, her mother Carol said. She said, "Just let me grow up. Let me make my own mistakes. You don't need to watch me. You don't need to be my shadow." On June 13th, 1996, when Angie failed to show up for a shift at a beauty supply store, a co-worker stopped by her apartment. The front door was unlocked. Angie was lying half naked on the bedroom floor. Her throat had been cut and she had been brutally stabbed. The attacker's semen was also discovered at the scene of the crime. The first 6 months of the investigation were frustrating for detectives, tips and leads going nowhere. Then in January 1997, an acquaintance of Angie's, named Ben Hobbs, was arrested in Nevada on suspicion of raping a woman at knife point. Investigators began interviewing Ben's friends, which led them to a 20-year-old high school dropout named Christopher Tapp. Although a DNA test failed to match Christopher to the semen found at the scene, investigators relentlessly grilled him for 28 hours over the next 3+ weeks. After denying he had any part in the crime, Christopher wilted under the interrogation, telling detectives he and 2 friends had gone to Angie's apartment on the night of her death. After a fight, Tapp said he held the woman down while his friends killed her. But video footage of the interrogation showed that detectives clearly fed an exhausted Tapp the details. When Christopher was officially charged in Angie's killing in 1997, he pleaded not guilty and went to trial, arguing before the jury that the admission had been coerced and that the DNA clearly showed he was not the killer. But on May 28, 1998, the jury convicted him of aiding and abetting, rape, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. Usually in these cases, when someone is convicted, it is case closed. However, in the official version of events, Christopher was the accessory, but investigators still had not identified the actual assailant. The investigation continued to stumble. They eventually submitted a portion of the suspect's DNA sample to a genealogical database in 2014 to see if it could point towards the assailant's family. Investigators received a list of 41 potential matches in July of 2014. One match was very close to the DNA sample from the crime scene evidence. Investigators received a search warrant to force Ancestry.com to hand over the name. In September 2014, detectives received a name. That name was Michael Usry Jr. In December of 2014, officers from the Louisiana State Police were outside knocking on Michael's door, asking the then 35-year-old to come downtown for a conversation. Michael was living in New Orleans with his wife. He was a low-budget filmmaker who had made a few short movies. Michael knew he had done nothing wrong, so he agreed to go with the detectives. Confused about why he was there, Michael did his best to answer the questions the investigators were asking. They seemed to perk up when he mentioned he had been on a trip to Idaho in 1996. Eventually, the detectives told Michael he was a suspect in a high-profile, unsolved crime. Michael later said, "The majority of time that I was in the interrogation room, I just didn't know what they were talking about. They finally had to look at me and go, 'No, we think that you, Michael Usry, we think that you are involved in this murder case.' But they had the wrong guy. Within 6 weeks, more DNA tests cleared Usry in early 2015. Meanwhile, Christopher is still in prison. In May 2016, he is working with the Innocence Project, and his attorneys filed a motion for post-conviction relief. They asserted that his confession was the result of police coercion and deception, and that videotapes of 3 of the 7 polygraph tests showed that coercion and deception had been withheld from the defense's trial team. In addition, the motion noted that his confession didn't fit the evidence. He had been told the officers that the crime had took place at about 1 a.m, but Angie had been with friends at about 12:30, and an autopsy showed her bladder was very full, indicating she had been asleep for some time. That motion would never be ruled on. On March 22, 2017, they reached an agreement and his rape conviction was vacated. The murder conviction was reduced to time served and he was released from prison. Eventually, on July 17, 2019, Christopher's murder conviction was vacated. He will end up suing for wrongful conviction, and in June of 2022, Idaho Falls were ordered to pay him $11.7 million. Investigators then decided to upload the DNA to a larger genealogical database, and experts identified a number of people who could be related to the case. Among them was Brian Lee Drips, who police learned at the time of the murder and rape was living across the street from Angie. He had even been interviewed by police at the time of the murder as a possible witness. On May 10, 2019, investigators drove to Caldwell, where Brian was living, to collect a DNA sample from a cigarette butt he threw into the road. Detectives ran into the road, collected the sample, and sent it to the Idaho State Police lab. The lab returned a positive match within 24 hours. Investigators took Brian into custody on May 15, 2019. During questioning, he confessed to the rape and murder. When he confessed, he described being on cocaine and alcohol when he went into Angie's apartment intending to rape her. He said he had a pocket knife but did not intend to murder her. It just happened. In 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison. Nancy Bennallaack. Nancy Bennallaack was 28 years old when she was murdered in 1970 in her apartment in Sacramento County. The case remained unsolved for a whopping 52 years until police announced they had found the killer in August of 2022. Nancy was found stabbed to death in her bedroom of her apartment with more than 30 stab wounds. On the night she was murdered, Nancy, who worked as a court reporter, and her fiancé returned to her apartment after a night out at around 11:30 p.m. on October 25, 1970. Her fiancé, who also worked in the court system, returned to his home later that night. They were due to be married the next month. The following day, which was a Monday, Nancy did not show up for work. Her co-worker called her son and asked him to check on her. With the help of the apartment manager, the co-worker's son opened up Nancy's apartment and found her murdered. Sometime between 11:30 that night and in the early morning hours of October 26th, the murderer broke in. Police believed that the murderer put tape over his fingertips, climbed up the second-story balcony, and attacked her. Her sliding door was left slightly open so her cat could go in and out of the apartment. If you are a regular follower of true crime, you may know that stabbing someone can cause your hand to slip and also cut yourself in the process. In this case, the murderer was also cut, badly, and a trail of blood led from her apartment to the middle of the apartment complex parking lot, where they believe he got in a vehicle and left the scene. Police obtained his DNA profile from the blood, and it had been in state and national databases since 2004, with no positive matches. In 2019, the Sacramento County Cold Case Team began a forensic genetic genealogy investigation, which is where the DNA profile is matched with relatives to narrow down who the suspect is. They got a potential match, and a relative of the murderer provided their DNA. The suspect was Richard John Davis, who was 27 at the time and lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy when he murdered her. Unfortunately, there will be no legal justice in this case, as he died in 1997 from what investigators believe was related to alcoholism, but the family now have some closure. Police do not know the motive for this murder,